Was it the beginning of a new modern world, a world of imagination, action, enterprise? Or was it the culmination of the Middle Ages, which had lasted for nearly 1,000 years? Or was it a bit of both? The Renaissance and the Age of Discovery, this time on the Western tradition. I told you a few programs back that the Middle Ages were invented by the Renaissance. But the Renaissance was invented by itself. I don't mean that people in the 14th or 15th century conjured up the word, but they acted as if they might do so at any time because they felt so excited by what was going on around them. Now, part of what was going on was the same old mess as before and after: wars, injustice, violence, misery. What we call the Renaissance, after all, ran from about the 14th century through the 16th. So it overlapped the late Middle Ages for more than 100 years. But there was an important difference. There were serious economic problems, but there was more enterprise, more wealth, more leisure in the Renaissance, and also more competition in the conspicuous consumption that went with wealth and leisure. And one form of consumption that especially soared was culture. Culture which adored and pursued antiquity with an extraordinary urgency and passion. Their literature and architecture and visual arts soared, and their achievements made contemporaries feel that they lived in a time when men were at last on the way to recapture the greatness of the ancients. Those ancients against whom the West had measured itself for 1,000 years. If you want to be objective, the West had been reviving since the 12th century at least. The great cathedrals hadn't waited for the 14th century, and previous generations had translated the Greeks, had studied philosophy and the laws of nature, had made technological improvements. In the 13th century, better chimney construction made heating more flexible and thus made privacy possible for the better off. The chimney probably affected the art of love more than the troubadours did, and it fostered more individualism than Renaissance philosophers did. And without another contemporary invention, eyeglasses, we probably would have had fewer philosophers anyway. Among other inventions of the 12th century was the spinning wheel, which not only made yarn cheaper, but also suggested the use of a belt to transmit power. And the wheelbarrow, which cut in half the number of people needed to haul small loads by substituting a wheel for the front man. And even the button, which revolutionized the history of clothing. So the Middle Ages was often innovative and increasingly productive. But what changed most in the 14th century was the mood. Perhaps because what was being done was less to the glory of God and more to the glory of man. You can see this in literature, where the rebirth of ancient Latin and ancient Greek revived the Greek belief in man as the measure of all things and introduced subversive notions of a life unencumbered by revealed religion. It's characteristic that this secularizing spirit was represented by men and sometimes by women who called themselves humanists because they were interested in human nature and human values. To put it differently, they were trying to discover the secret of the good life, the virtuous life. And they thought they could find it not in the centuries just past, where no model seemed to fit their bill, but by looking back at antiquity. If you read Seneca or Cicero, and if you wrote like them, then you could hope to become as good, as great as they had been. So the humanists revived the classics, and they studied and they taught them in the humanities, which were supposed to teach you to be good, that is, virtuous and honorable in private and especially in public. The humanities stressed personal judgment, the worth and possibilities of individuals, man's free will, his superiority over unformed, unpolished nature, his duty to society. And they are at the origins of the classical curriculum, which was going to last into the 20th century. The typical Renaissance humanist was a professional scholar. Today, he would be a professor. Like many professors, a lot of humanists were chiefly interested in splitting hairs or coming out with learned quotes. But also, like some professors, humanists wanted to prepare their students and readers to operate wisely in the world. Ideally, most of these students would be princes or courtiers or men and women who exercise some power around them. Certainly they would have to be educated because they had to know Latin. One of the most famous humanists of the Renaissance was a Dutch monk, Desiderius Erasmus, who lived from 1466 to 1536. When he wasn't editing texts, Erasmus dedicated himself to teaching morals and culture, good manners, common sense, civility, and the Christian virtues, all of which were as signally lacking in his day as they are today. But I prefer one of his Italian contemporaries, Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a less erudite man, but more inclined to think for himself, and what this produced you can see if you read his little book, The Prince. Machiavelli has been much condemned as cynical and immoral because his book describes power politics as they are and not as they should be. But Machiavelli had a lot of experience with politics in one of the most politicized cities of the time, Florence. This is the court of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who ruled the city when Machiavelli was growing up there. In the mess that followed Lorenzo's death, Machiavelli learned to consider politics as a jungle where the strong take what they can, the weak go to the wall, and ordinary people fare better under strong rulers than under weak ones. In a way, Machiavelli simply described what he saw around him. More important, though, he separated metaphysics from politics. Religion or morality or law became just another factor of political action, like armies, like taxes. And this was a radical break from medieval tradition. But apart from Machiavelli, and perhaps I should add Thomas More, most humanists have little to say to us today. Their writings are not very readable, they're overstuffed with classical references and quotes. It's much more exciting and much more accessible to trace the new spirit of the Renaissance in the visual arts, which really illustrate the vigor and the excitement of the time and its focus on human possibilities.
You
You can begin to see the change by contrasting the great mosaics of the 11th and 12th centuries with the work of Giotto, who lived during the late 13th and early 14th centuries in Florence in the early days of the Renaissance. Many of Giotto's contemporaries still created great, majestic, hypnotic figures of authority and power, or else they painted puppet shows in the impersonal Byzantine manner, full of lifeless mannequins in splendid attire. But Giotto's work was affected by the new revival of classical ideals, and especially by the new humanity that St. Francis had brought to religion. Giotto's approach was emotional and urgent. Unlike the stiff manner of the Middle Ages, it expressed a new humanity. So Giotto was innovative, but he was also profoundly Christian and medieval. Characteristically, his best-known paintings can be seen in a chapel in Padua called the Scrovegni Chapel because it was built by the son of a usurer of that name. Old Mr. Scrovegni was so notorious that Dante placed him in one of the circles of hell in the Inferno. So here you have a typical medieval act of redemption. The usurer's son holds out his chapel in a propitiatory gesture to make up for the ill-gotten family wealth. Now, compare this with a picture painted in 1434, 100 years after Giotto's death, Jan van Eyck's portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife. We are in Bruges, but the subject is an Italian merchant and his young bride. We are in the house of a businessman and a moneylender like Scrovegni, but the couple is presented as if they were nobles, and they make no apologies for their money. And look at the realism and the precision of presentation, which are in keeping with the rationality of a new, more secular society. 50 years go by, and Botticelli is painting his Birth of Venus in Florence around 1485. By this time, spiritual concerns have been drained out. Not from all life, of course, far from it, but from this painting. All Botticelli seems to care about is sensuousness and recreating the ancients. He takes an ancient subject, he tries to paint it as the ancients would have done, and he revels not in spiritual, but in sensuous beauty. Then another 50 years go by, and Michelangelo paints the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, finishing in 1541. It's an overwhelming composition, and the best thing really is just to look at it and gasp. I mention it here because it's so different from any kind of medieval Christian spirit of hierarchy or order. And in the same room, there are also frescoes that Michelangelo painted a quarter century earlier. These are about the creation. And they look to me like a powerful, explosive affirmation of man. So in these two works, the Renaissance has really supplanted the Middle Ages. When he painted The Last Judgment, Michelangelo was an old man in his 60s. Rome had been sacked and pillaged a few years before, and the old sense of unlimited possibilities had started to crack. But the thing that strikes me is that whether in a vision of torment, doubt, defeat, or in a vision of affirmation, you can find here in a Vatican chapel at the center of Western Christendom. You can find here one of the ongoing themes of the modern Western world. Man is great. He's always in trouble, but he's the most impressive thing we've got. And this is a theme you wouldn't have found 400 years before. This greatness of man was going to be proved and accelerated in another way by the invention of printing from movable type, which occurred in Germany around 1445 and which we attribute to a goldsmith called Gutenberg. By 1480, over 110 European towns had printing shops. And by 1500, about 20 million books had been printed. And the 16th century was going to see at least 10 times more than that. The humanists quickly realized the advantage of cheaper and more numerous books. So did the church. At first, most of the books were for clerks and clerics anyway, and most of them were in Latin, which meant that access to reading was limited. But by the 16th century, this changed. Magistrates, burghers, tradesmen owned books, often in their own language. A publishing industry grew up to cater to more simple people with pious books and entertaining books and almanacs. And chivalric romances of adventure and glory were turned out in vast numbers by Italian and Spanish printers who fed the dreams of future conquistadores. And in fact, during the 15th century and the first half of the 16th, the Renaissance, a period of intense and passionate cultural achievement, was going to coexist with the age of discovery, a period of fervent expansion. Just as there had never been so much variety and creativity in the arts, so too had there never been so much exploration and discovery. When Bartholomew Diaz rounds the Cape of Good Hope in 1487, Botticelli is helping to paint the Sistine Chapel in Rome. In 1506, Columbus dies impoverished, forgotten, still believing he discovered the coast of Asia. And the same year, Bramante begins to build St. Peter's in Rome. In 1513, Balboa crosses the Isthmus of Panama to reveal the existence of the Pacific, and Machiavelli publishes The Prince. Raphael dies in 1520 when Magellan is sailing around the world and a rebellion is gathering in Germany around a monk named Martin Luther, a rebellion which would soon burst into the Reformation. And in the 1530s, while Pizarro is conquering Peru, Erasmus and Rabelais are in full bloom, while Michelangelo is painting his Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel.
The Renaissance and the Age of Discovery were two peaks of achievement, one of imagination, the other of action. But did they have anything in common? Is it possible to say that Erasmus wrote and Raphael painted and Bartholomew Diaz ventured past the Cape of Storms in obedience to a similar impulse? And was this impulse derived from some common experience, a way of thinking, an approach to living that historians have agreed to call the European Renaissance? Did the urge to discover new lands grow from the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance?
and what effect did the broadening of geographical horizons have on the mental horizons of the people at home? The first thing we can say is that human nature did not change, but the scope of human aspirations was increased by greater material possibilities. By the 1480s and 90s, Europe had developed an agricultural base, an industrial capacity, a superiority in arms, and a skill in sailing the oceans that enabled it to explore the rest of the globe, to conquer and loot and colonize it for the next 4 centuries in a way that the greediest ancient Roman would have envied. Many of the material things that made this exploration possible, however, came out of the Middle Ages. The magnetic compass was adopted by 1187. Sea charts and pilot books were available after 1280. And the ships and the guns that explorers used were not developed by Renaissance intellectuals, but by craftsmen. And just as the means of exploration developed out of the Middle Ages, so did the motives behind it. This is the reception of Columbus by Ferdinand and Isabella. They and other rulers were interested in gold and silver to supplement dwindling sources at home, and in slaves, and in spices from the East, which were necessary in the first place to preserve food, which spoiled fast in the ages before refrigeration, and then quite simply to make lousy food eatable, tough and stringy meat from skinny cattle, tasteless vegetables, unappetizing and often spoiled food in general. But this spice trade was threatened by the advance of a new Muslim power, the Turks, who took Constantinople in 1453, and the Balkans as well, thus upsetting the commercial balance of the Mediterranean. Before that, Italy had enjoyed a near monopoly of the spice trade for several centuries, which was the source of much of its prosperity. So the countries of Western Europe sought to outflank the Turks and the Italians as well. France, Spain, Portugal, England, and the Netherlands all saw the possibilities of sailing south or sailing west to reach the East Indies, and they had the means to do it. Another motive, universally expressed and quite widely believed, was the desire to extend Christianity. And here too, the age of discovery did not see something new, but the redirection of an earlier medieval motive, which had linked conquest and gain with missionary enthusiasm in the Crusades, which Europe had sent out since the 11th century. This crusading ideal had declined precipitously, but it was revived by the advance of the Turks in the southern and eastern Mediterranean and by the fall of Constantinople. And it was maintained by the war against the Moors in Spain, which only ended significantly in 1492, at which point the Spanish crown finally gave Columbus permission to sail. The most Renaissance aspect of discovery lay in the cooperation between the crown, geographical experts, and highly educated merchants out for profit, but also very curious and increasingly well-informed. And we can find aspects of a new mentality among seamen and travelers as well. We find it in a Venetian called Cadamosto, who said that he joined the Portuguese sailing down the African coast in 1455 and 1456 in order to see interesting sights. And we find it in another Italian, Antonio Pigafetta, who joined Magellan's expedition 60 years later to experiment, he said, and go and see with my own eyes a part of those things we have heard so much about. And finally, we find it in the great explorers themselves, who were not just leaders and seamen, but who had to visualize their undertaking within the context of an emerging knowledge of the world as a whole, testing the hypotheses of medieval geography and developing them into a new science altogether, as we shall see in our next program. The discovery of new societies confronted Europeans with a dazzling range of beliefs and institutions different from their own. It persuaded some that the world was their oyster, and it led others to begin a revolution in critical thinking. The Renaissance and the New World, this time on the Western tradition. Last time we ended with a confluence of two great movements, the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries. And yet we also saw how many of the material things that made exploration possible came out of the Middle Ages, as did many of the motivations of European governments. Primarily the quest for spices and slaves and converts to Christianity. But what about the explorers themselves? Do they reflect a new Renaissance mentality that we define as modern? Or was their vision primarily a medieval one? What kind of men were they? What motivated them? As evidence, we have Richard Chancellor's statement that he was describing his search for a northeast passage in 1553 so that, as he says, he may encourage others to the like travel. Now, this is a very modern kind of self-awareness and an equally modern sense of being part of an evolution, not a one-shot adventure like Marco Polo's trip to China in the 13th century, but an ongoing process. And both are very close to the intellectual temper of the Renaissance. And there is another Renaissance trait which the explorers possessed, and that is their appetite for fame. The passion for glory provides a major theme of Renaissance art, especially with the presentation of distinguished contemporaries as memorable characters from antiquity. This is Gianfrancesco Gonza, an Italian captain general depicted as Mars, the god of war, while his wife Isabella is Venus. Some explorers like Columbus were also fired by missionary zeal, but fame, the desire to be known for having accomplished great deeds, this was a strong component in the explorers' motivation. And that became especially true as more and more travel writing came on the market, as printing spread and began to compete with romances of chivalry. So here you have the search for fame, the search for fortune, but within a context of exactness and full proof. And in a world where it seemed that very few things were still left undone. And if they were undone, that was a good reason for getting them done. And this is very much a Renaissance attitude. But we are on even firmer ground when we turn, oddly enough, to theory. Theory was the fuel of action in the Renaissance as it had not been in the Middle Ages. the revival of antiquity, the rediscovery of theories which appeared to have influenced action in the past, produced new concepts and models for action that would change the world. The humanists, or at least their pupils, really did try to be the all-round men that Cicero praised. The architects and artists were actually affected by theoretical treatises based on assumptions about what had produced great art in ancient times. And the soldiers, who now had longer pauses between crises, adopted all sorts of military ideas from the ancients about how to organize their troops, or fortify, or besiege a city. And it might have had the same effect on geography if it hadn't been for the actual voyages which forced Renaissance scholars to reconsider their theories about the size and shape of the world in the light of actual experience. Not all of the classical theories agreed either. Ptolemy, a 2nd century Greek, was one established authority who believed that you couldn't sail around the world because Africa merged with a large continent that filled the southern hemisphere and joined Africa to India. On the other hand, there was the geographer Strabo, a contemporary of Augustus, who thought that the ocean sea to the west washed the southern shores of Asia. You had to be careful when you sailed the ocean because you might fall over the edge. Still, Strabo believed, to quote him, that the uninhabited world forms a complete circle, itself meeting itself, so that if the immensity of the Atlantic did not prevent it, we could sail from Iberia to India along one and the same parallel. By the early 1400s, Strabo's theories were gaining ground as sea charts and ship logs got better. There was also constant contact between the sailors, the theorists, and the map makers. The best example of this could be found at Sagres, at the southwest tip of Portugal, where in the middle 1430s the Portuguese prince Henry the Navigator, a remarkable figure, founded a small court to which he attracted seamen, cartographers, astronomers, shipbuilders, and instrument makers, and from which, with improved ships and maps and instruments, he sent out expeditions that went further and further down the African coast, practically to the Ivory Coast. Henry's ultimate purpose, and he wasn't alone in this, was to outflank the power of Islam and to establish direct commercial contact with the source of gold and slaves, ivory and spices in Africa and in Asia. So Henry's brother went to Florence to buy maps, and Columbus elicited an important letter from another Florentine geographer, Toscanelli, that assured him that he could get to China by sailing west. And when the sailors made their discoveries, they were quickly recorded in the maps the cartographers drew up and revised for other sailors to use. This map belonged to Columbus. In essence, this process of exploration was the first demonstration of the scientific method, proceeding from hypothesis to experiment and then on to a new hypothesis. And it was demonstrated for all interested men to see in the largest and the most dramatic way. the hypothesis that there was open water between Europe and Asia to the west, as Columbus first believed, was disproved not by abstract calculation, but concretely by revealing an enormous new territory full of exotic peoples and providing a new way of life for thousands of soldiers and settlers. And it was a continuous process with the findings and ideas of one man entered on maps until further experimental voyages disproved them or revised them.
What you have to remember is that the scientific method which we take as the hallmark of modern thinking could not be applied rigorously in a pure scientific field in astronomy or physics or chemistry until the 17th century, when the pendulum clock and the telescope and the microscope were developed. Before that, however hard the would-be scientist thought, it was difficult to verify his ideas because the means for scientific proof were rudimentary. One field where you could actually verify theory was the field of discovery through the cooperation between the theorizers at home and the observers in their ships. You might even say that the first scientific laboratory was the world itself.
So the age of discovery and the Renaissance were in partnership. But it was a fumbling and confused relationship because the first explorers carried with them a mass of medieval presuppositions which prevented them from making a properly objective report on what they saw. What the public wanted and got a lot of were monsters and marvels, and giants and dwarfs and headless men with faces in their chests, and dog-headed men, and men with one huge foot which they could use as a sunshade, and all kinds of other grotesques. Another feature in the new lands that people wanted to find or to hear about was the existence of an earthly paradise. Some golden age existence where men could be found happy, naked, free, without government or property, without disease or melancholy. One major reason why Europeans wanted to believe in the existence of paradise was that they fared so badly at home, where they were torn by war, eaten by plague, brutalized by poverty and famine, and all kinds of other troubles. So explorers were tempted to color their facts to fit their hopes, and publicists popularized and vulgarized their reports to turn the Indian into a noble savage and life in the New World into a kind of moral symbol of the Golden Age. But these fantasies were going to collide with something else, something very urgent and very concrete, which was the religious issue. Significantly, the first question European intellectuals asked about the natives of the New World was not what are they like, but can they be saved? And that was because the societies being discovered in the New World did not fit into the framework of the book of Genesis. So it wasn't clear whether Jesus died for these creatures and whether they were really human at all. The question was important because the sort of treatment the Indian might expect depended on the answer. The view that the Indian was an animal, hence a natural slave, this view was pressed with some force. 16th century Englishmen, for instance, assumed that the Indians were on the whole wild, ignorant, and animal-like. For their part, the Indians quite sensibly refuse to work the hours where the clothes follow the diet of Europeans. So the way was open for the pessimists to point out that Indians were incapable of living virtuously and freely, and that they must therefore be by nature slaves. This notion fitted very well with a growing clamor for cheap labor to work in silver mines like this one in Peru, or on sugar estates in a climate which sapped the energy of white men and which would soon take the lives of the natives. Even worse would be the devastating European diseases for which Indians had no immunities. With European brutality confirmed by economic need, with forcible conversion to Christianity accepted as common necessity, the slave trade took on a new and long-enduring lease of life, or rather death. While in this painting, a European artist depicts Indians worshipping a column erected by the French explorer Laudonnière. So here we find several further ingredients of the modern world. A new treasury of myth and of incentives on one hand, and on the other, the role of the European as exploiter and colonist, rationalizing his activities by drawing on those very myths to justify his doings.
And yet the counter-agents were at work within the experience itself. Above all, the novel tendency to compare and contrast, which arose out of the variety of new information and experience pouring in on Europeans during the Renaissance. Where medieval people reasoned by association, learning about one thing by connecting it with something similar, modern reasoning involves contrast as well as association. This is different from that. What do I learn from the comparison? And this kind of thinking entered our intellectual habits not only when the humanists of the Renaissance revived the civilization of pre-Christian antiquity and compared it with their own, but also when newly discovered societies all over the world confronted Europeans with a wide range of governments and religions and social habits that were different from their own.
But before the sophisticated races of the East or the more primitive races of the West could present thought-provoking contrasts, they had to be seen not merely as picturesque, but as the product of a specific environment. You had to go beyond the striking detail, the nakedness, the war paint. You had to go on to a more anthropological approach. And you begin to find this when one of Vasco da Gama's officers spends the night with the natives of the Cape of Good Hope to see how they live and what they eat. Or when missionaries begin to learn the languages and the religious beliefs of the peoples they were trying to convert, because they could only hope to convince the natives when they had entered into their world and values. And by the 16th century, the greatest mind of the 16th century, I mean Michel de Montaigne, is fascinated by cannibals, by so-called savages who seemed far less savage and far closer to happiness and virtue than his own fellow citizens. Not just far less savage, more sensible too. Cannibals kill, but they kill for a purpose. They want to eat. We, says Montaigne, we kill to no good purpose. And so here, 400 years ago, we can hear the forest murmurs of relativism. But it was very far away, and it was going to be a very slow process that culminated in the 18th century, when the comparative study of strange societies and religions and brave new worlds would lead to a critical re-evaluation of European religion, philosophy, and political structures. But that had its roots, I think, in the Renaissance, in the growing willingness based on a growing necessity to see, estimate, evaluate, test, to learn more and actually use it. Invest it, so to speak, in order to learn more still, to seek not only knowledge, but precise knowledge, to examine not only the self subjectively, which was one of the great joys of Renaissance humanists, but the world objectively, because objectivity was the great liberator, the widener of mental horizons, the progenitor of modern science. It was fed by forcing the imagination not inward, but outward, exposing it to challenging information about different ways of life. It was the humanists like Erasmus who laid the ground for this critical and comparative approach to information and experience. And when Erasmus and the other humanists said that one authority was superior to another, that a Roman author was a better source of wisdom than a doctor of the medieval church, they implied the right to decide between different authorities, and therefore the possibility to judge for yourself. And the best of them, like Leonardo da Vinci, decided to place experience and experiment above any book, above any second-hand authority, and this was something new. Leonardo was not only a great painter of subtlety and understated harmony, he was also a great architect and engineer. His great love was scientific observation, especially anatomy. He was fascinated by the forces that move nature. This sketch is from his study of hydrology, the properties of water. And he approached these forces in a thoroughly empirical way. When he works out his geological theories, he doesn't look for a text in Aristotle, he looks around him. He notes that things that are born in salt water are found on high mountains far from present seas. And he concludes the phenomena we witness explain the past. He dissects bodies. He suggests the possibilities of comparative anatomy. He predicts the helicopter. And when he dies in France in 1519, his title is first painter, architect, and mechanic of the king. Soon after Leonardo's death, a French physician, Ambroise Paré, provided the formula of the new scientific approach when he wrote that we have to use the ancients as stilts or towers from which we can see further than they did. But, said Paré, whenever experiment contradicted the ancients, we must follow what we see. Tradition is no use if it just encourages you to go on making other people's mistakes because you're too lazy or too timid to strike out for yourself. I would prefer to do everything by myself than to fall into error with the sages and even with all mankind. Knowledge, says Paré, is a great thing, but only if it is based on experience. This new attitude was going to lead men to examine things for themselves, natural phenomena, political institutions, even the Bible. Until the Renaissance, all these had been accepted simply because they were there. Now they could be considered in terms of appropriateness, effectiveness, and opportunity.
Obviously, this didn't all happen at once. Most people conformed as they had always done without much question. But the fact remains that by the 1600s, knowledge and science had ceased to rest on an inert tradition transmitted from the past. They became the knowledge, science, investigation of what is, which you acquire by searching and looking and drawing conclusions from what you see. And this is a revolution, or at least it's the beginning of a revolution, as we shall see in the programs ahead.
A great religious revival sparked by a man driven to the edge of despair. An explosion of social unrest and bitter political conflict. Together, they gave old enemies new battle cries and shook Christendom to its very core. The Reformation, this time on the Western tradition.
A lot of history is about kings and queens and battles because for a long time so much of history turned around kings and queens and battles. The whims and personalities of princes and of the great men who served them influenced policies, made wars, made treaties, affected the lives of everybody else. Now, this rule had been suspended during part of the Middle Ages when power had been restricted to a local scale, but as the 15th century turned into 16th, modern monarchs and modern monarchies appeared. They wanted to be all-powerful, and they persuaded their subjects that indeed they were, or at least they should be, all-powerful. Even their guardian angels were considered more important than the angels that guarded people of lesser rank.
There was Louis XI of France, who lived in the 15th century, Ferdinand of Spain, who straddled the 15th and 16th centuries, and Henry VIII of England, who was born the year before Columbus sailed and who died in 1547. These were the fathers of the modern state. It would take centuries to be perfected, but from the very beginning, the modern state pursued four major tasks. First, to secure obedience, to neutralize all possible challengers, to gain the monopoly of force, to maintain law and order, to make the violence it exerted the only legitimate violence. And what this meant, you can see in the gibbets that figure prominently in a lot of paintings. The second thing the state had to achieve was to exert control over economic life, to facilitate the circulation and exchange of goods, to grasp as much as possible of national income. Third, it had to refocus patriotic identity from the local to the national scale. Here we see not only Henry III of France, but also the lily, or fleur-de-lis, which had become the symbol of French royalty. And finally, the state had to dominate or control the religious life of society, or at least ally itself with the representatives of religion. Now, we've already seen that the rise of the modern state was dependent on both the growth of a modern economy of capital and account books like this one, and on the arms that new technology made possible and the new economy made affordable. But it also owed a great deal to the revival of Roman law, which had survived in Italy, and which after the 13th century spread through Europe, carried by lawyers trying to strengthen the king against the clergy and against his feudal vassals. Roman law carried the idea of an absolute ruler, the princeps, whose will was law. This combined with another classical ideal, that of the hero, who is practically a god, strong, benevolent, and wise. This heroic royal figure was going to incarnate what we today describe as nationalism, a sentiment of patriotic pride in origins and in past glories, which would be used to justify present dominion and future greatness. By the 16th century, Italians, Spaniards, and Frenchmen learned to sing the glory of their particular country, to glorify a national character or a national tongue. German humanists compared the German past to that of ancient Rome and inspired this triumphal arch for their king and emperor Maximilian. Shakespeare's plays praised England, disparaged its neighbors, exalted patriotic sentiment. The reference to the past which inspired the present could also focus on the ideal figure of the prince who personified his people and the nation. In theory, the prince answered the need for a strong central authority to impose unity and order. In practice, the material interests of most princes were served by more law and order. More law and order improved revenues. Regular revenues paid for the regular armies that could impose more law and order and squeeze more revenues, thus further increasing the central power.
With this increasing centralization of the state, the modern relationship between the central authority and the individual subject and taxpayer began to take shape. So did the representative institutions, the councils, parliaments, estates that mark the modern West and that are all related to taxes. When states and rulers no longer turned for aid to vassals but to all their subjects, they had to win their consent. But popular assemblies composed of all the citizens, as in the ancient Greek cities, were not feasible where the number of people and the distances between them were too great. And so, as a substitute for personal attendance, there developed the concept of representation. The idea that certain men, elected or appointed, could speak for other men or cities or estates.
Some of these representative assemblies became instruments of opposition to royal authority, but for the most part, their very existence gave disparate territories a sense of unity they had not had before. Voting taxes and paying them didn't just affect the purses of people, it affected their minds as well. At the same time, the princes needed administrators. In France, whose kings were best served in these matters, there were some 12,000 civil servants in 1505, 1 to about 1,250 people. 400 years later, there would be one for every 70 French men and women, and today there are almost as many state employees as there are citizens to be administered. The princes also needed soldiers to back up their officials and, above all, for war, which was the greatest industry of their time, as it often is of our time. The princes also needed representatives for negotiations, for diplomacy, which is the continuance of war by other means, and which the 15th and 16th centuries were beginning to develop, along with international law, a code that governed relations between sovereigns and between sovereign states. Meanwhile, medieval concepts were disappearing. The Holy See was not even a shadow of what it had once been. The Pope was an Italian prince trading in what merchandise he had: ecclesiastical appointments, dispensations from the application of church law to permit divorce, absolve from adultery or even murder, indulgences which provided remission of sins in return for worthy acts, or better still, in return for payment. As for the emperor, like Sigismund of Hungary here, who was crowned in 1411, he had no power to tax or to impose his will outside his own territories. He was simply the highest bidder in the auction for the imperial crown of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1519, for example, Charles V, King of Spain, was the winner. He had the backing of the great banking houses, especially the Fuggers of Augsburg, who advanced most of the money to buy the electors and the Pope, and who, just as importantly, refused to credit the bank drafts of Charles's competitors. It's from this point on that the power of money or finance capital dominates the world. Financial power created the armies with which the new emperor conquered his enemies and kept his huge empire together. Charles's grandfather, the Emperor Maximilian, had not been able to collect anything like regular taxes, so he hadn't been able to keep up anything like a real standing army. A few kings, like Louis XI in France and Ferdinand of Aragon, had got one. But Charles was the first emperor who managed to do this, and if changed economic conditions played their part, a new business outlook and a business alliance played equally important parts. Charles's son, Philip II, who lived from 1527 to 1598, was not only the King of Spain, but also King of Portugal, which he inherited through his mother. He ruled an empire far greater than that of ancient Rome, an empire that stretched from the Americas to Asia. You have to imagine the scale of this empire in terms of what distance meant in the 16th century. A round trip from Lisbon to Goa in India took 18 months. A trip from Seville in Spain to Lima in Peru took 2 years. And from Seville to Manila in the Philippines, which were named for Philip, of course, it took up to 5 years. You can understand the remark of a Spanish viceroy that if death came from Madrid, we should all live to a very old age. No doubt if death had come, it would have come by written order. Spanish government was government by paper and by the bureaucracy that shuffled the paper. The bureaucrats were trained in universities whose numbers in Spain tripled during the 16th century from 11 to 33, and which were also set up across the Atlantic. The University of Santo Domingo was founded in 1538, the first university in the Americas, 100 years before Harvard College. Others followed in Mexico and Peru. And it was the flow of capital in the form of gold and silver from America that paid for the universities and the bureaucracy, that lubricated the wheels of commerce and fueled the military and political supremacy of Spain through the 16th and the 17th centuries. So Spain's American empire made her European empire possible.
The new alliance between capital and the state would be disturbing for a lot of people, as would be the newly important part which money came to play in the life of a society whose members had managed without it, or with very little of it, for a long time. There were waves of speculation, waves of bankruptcies, and these didn't just affect the bankers and the merchants, but also a whole series of dependent industries and enterprises, and of course workers. This was the crucial period when Europe switched from the more or less stable economic plane of the Middle Ages to an economic life that isn't really very different from our own. A life where the value of money fluctuated, unemployment became endemic, cities got overcrowded, and rising prices and lower wages were experienced everywhere. And the result of this was resentment, unrest, revolts in the trading cities, peasant risings in the countryside, and agitation by nobles suffering from inflation.
The social dissatisfaction created by this insecurity and unrest was going to come to a head in Germany and the lowlands, and it was going to break out under the banner of a religious idea. On October 31st, 1517, a monk named Martin Luther, who taught theology at the University of Wittenberg in Saxony, nailed on the door of the castle church 95 theses, that is, propositions or arguments, against the papal misuse of indulgences and absolution. Now, Luther's gesture was contentious, but it was not revolutionary. Proposing a debate on theological theses was accepted practice. Luther's language was perfectly appropriate for academic debate, and yet the echo of his gesture was going to shake the Western world. Religious war and religious rebellions invariably cut into political conflicts. They provide old enemies with new battle cries. They contribute new and profound causes of friction. Religious conflict ravaged Germany until the 1550s. France and the Netherlands through the second half of the century, and it threw England into political confusion. Within one generation, the seamless robe of Western Christendom was rent. From then on, men stood divided by Christian faith as much as by political allegiance or economic interest. This was the Protestant Reformation.
Now, obviously, a religious contest on this scale doesn't break out in an irreligious society. Luther himself is evidence of this. He was driven to the verge of madness by uncertainty and doubt and guilt and the terrible fear that he could never achieve salvation, until he realized that it's not what you do or don't do, it's what's inside you that counts. Your faith in God and in His salvation, His free, forgiving mercy, that are more important than your weakness, your failings, your feeble attempts to atone.
The problem that upset Luther, that terrorized him before he found his justification in faith, this passionate anxiety, also upset and frightened a lot of other people and made them listen to Luther when he found a solution to his own problems and offered it as a solution to their problems, a way to achieve salvation, which, as Albrecht Dürer, the painter, put it, opened up new worlds to me. Another evidence of contemporary religious concern is late Gothic art of a flamboyant style that showed off for all to see just how much money and how much art men would invest in the palaces of God. But the age of flamboyant Gothic is also an age of flamboyant piety. This was the time when we begin to get images of the suffering Christ and images of the heart surrounded with thorns, which would be followed by the future cult of the Sacred Heart, and fraternities of the Passion that still survive today in Central and South America and in Spain. There was also the devotion of the Rosary, which is a way of praying and honoring the Virgin by reciting 150 Hail Marys, and a whole host of other practices glorifying the Lady who appeared more and more like the channel of the grace her divine Son provided for men. And from the Virgin, one moved back to her mother, St. Anne, whose great vogue came at the turn of the 15th century and beyond, with the growth of the theory of Immaculate Conception, first of the Virgin, then also of her mother. Even Erasmus wrote that he had been devoured with piety for her since his tenderest youth. This, incidentally, was also a time when many male babies, as well as female, were baptized Anne, such as the French Duke and Marshal Anne de Montmorency. It was also a great time for pilgrimages, with Venice fostering a whole new industry of pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Law courts sometimes sentenced the guilty party to a pilgrimage to one or another sanctuary, where today they would inflict a fine. Along with this, there was an entire cult of relics, various objects from the lives of the saints, even parts of their bodies. At the same time, the Church was printing up indulgences and bringing out hundreds of writings, first for the priests, then for the public, translated from Latin or written directly in French, German, English for the middling bourgeoisie which ignored Latin, and for those pious women who could read. If we look at contemporary art, we can hardly find a Flemish painting without a pious image pinned to the wall. In the 15th and 16th centuries, more and more, God and the saints operate very close to the human plane, and the new naturalism of the artists reflects a growing familiarity or desire for familiarity between the worshipper and the worshipped. This was a period in which the plastic arts provided the imagination with a vision of a very human Christ, and above all, a very humane one, infinitely pitiful and suffering and good, very close to men and women who could recognize their own image on the panels and the paintings which once upon a time bore images of idealized and superior figures. A very human Christ, a very human Virgin Mary, a vast family of saints. Altogether then, there was no sense in the 15th and 16th centuries that the springs of faith were drying up. There was no loss of interest in religion, no hostility to the old practices. On the contrary, the impression one gets is of a lot of piety and a great appetite for the divine with a great variety of expression. And yet, as far as one can tell, there was also a sense of unease, a discomfort, a certain vague aspiration towards something else. And it came from that new class that had been moving up, not only in riches, but also in influence and status. And these were the people who manufactured and traded and practiced law in the growing urban centers, the city burghers whom we now describe as the bourgeoisie. In our next program, we shall see how their concerns and their interests were going to shake the Western world. Reformation, reaction, new dogmatisms, new pragmatisms. Europe stirred, especially its cities. Printing spread new ideas, and artists turned to secular subjects and everyday life. The rise of the middle classes, this time on the Western tradition. Last time we began to explore the great religious and political changes of the 16th century, which went hand in hand with the urban activities and the rise of urban social groups that nowadays we describe as bourgeois. Now, these burghers were not, for the most part, unscrupulous adventurers, fortune hunters, nouveaux riches who had popped up out of nothing through their rackets, through their speculations. There were some of those, of course, but on the whole, the bourgeois were not solely concerned with gain. Many of them got on by hard and patient labor. And many had a kind of seriousness, a need and respect for morality and for knowledge that made them accumulate books about the lives of the saints in their libraries, that made them devote half their wills to invocations to God and to the saints, and bequests to pious causes. And even sometimes it led them to retire at an early age and devote their time to study and prayer. The bourgeois were also realists in a hard world, but their realism did not exclude a strong sense of duty and a strong need of religious certainty and comfort. The question then became what kind of certainty, because as the medieval order collapsed, the old certainties did not suffice anymore. Remember that the bourgeois were merchants, traders, travelers, who saw and compared a lot of people and a lot of places, and who drew from this experience a sense of relativity, of relative values. And because they dealt in quantity and money and material things, they also developed a sense of precision, of exactness, above all perhaps of practical solutions. They read the ancients and drew from them the idea of a religion that was clear and reasonable and reasonably human. Now, what kind of religion did the official church have to offer? Simple folk had their saints and hellfire. More educated people were offered church services that were either perfunctory, purely formalistic, and when they looked beyond, they found theologians who wrote books for other theologians. This was part of the trouble. In some ways, the Protestant Reformation was less a revolt against corruption than against cliquishness and condescension. The basic argument of the theologians was that dogma was beyond the grasp of reason, and therefore the faithful should accept this fact and accept the dogma without trying to understand it. There was a dryness here, a drought of the spirit that the reformers rose against as much as they rose against the superstitions fed to the masses. When Luther said, Juristen böse Christen, lawmen are bad Christians, he was talking about a kind of religious sterility in the church, formalized and legalized. This was not the sort of theology that was suited to the new men of the cities who grew in number and importance, who developed a new group consciousness, and who developed a taste for clarity and lucidity by reading the ancients and by reading humanists like Erasmus. So there was bound to be a clash between the aspirations of the bourgeoisie, which wanted to reconcile its action and its faith, and the status quo of an anachronistic church.
Now, I don't want to make my explanation too narrow. No single interpretation can ever be valid, and there is no exclusive relation between the Reformation and the rise of the bourgeoisie. For one thing, the 16th century bourgeoisie were not the dominant social group they became in the 19th century. Peasants and nobles were also spiritually ill at ease and discontented. But the church had always to contend with heretics or potential heretics, most of them concerned with bringing people closer to salvation and to God. It had always managed to handle these heretics by absorbing them or by burning them. At this time, the church had lost its touch. And if that happened, it was at least partly connected with this burgher-related spirit that I've described.
The gap between the church and the bourgeoisie grew wider every day. The more so because most of the clergy, especially the theologians, didn't know and didn't much care about the concerns of their time. They lived among themselves. They closed their eyes to everything but internal church affairs. And even those clergy who realized that the church did need to change thought that they could save religion simply by reforming the clergy and the church machinery, a kind of party purge. Improve the education of the clergy, reform its discipline, and everything would be okay.
Perhaps the clergy were right, but I think they missed the point at issue. The point on which the Reformation struggle really seems to have started, which is the issue of authority. The old men and the establishment in general envisioned reform as merely making adjustments to the repository of authority, the clergy. And they thought that this would be sufficient. The new men, however, wanted them to demonstrate the right and the nature of authority itself. This was the basic difference out of which the Reformation came. And the Reformation essentially offered the bourgeois two things above all others that the church had not done. One, that the Bible be written not in Latin but in the vulgar tongue so that everybody could read it. And two, the idea of justification by faith. The idea that faith alone justifies and saves the believer, not the myriad rituals and practices that lay at the core of the church.
These ideas were not plucked out of the air by Martin Luther in 1517 or by John Calvin, the French theologian and reformer who was banished from Paris in 1528 for his Protestant teachings. The ideas had been there before, in a mood, in a widespread yearning. These in turn led to new translations of the Bible in the vernacular, which were then placed in the hands of the faithful without cuts or reservations or previous censorship by some body of official interpreters, and this gave the people of the time two novelties. First, a living human God, and second, a radical transformation of the whole notion of priesthood. People wanted to get nearer to God, nearer to Christ, but they felt that they were being held off, kept away for lack of an opportunity to engage in a direct dialogue between the believer and his Redeemer. This direct dialogue would be facilitated, however, if the Bible was written in your own language, so you could read it yourself in your own home. But that would make it a dialogue from which the priest was henceforth absent, or at least subordinated, unwanted, sometimes even resented. The fact is that more and more, these burghers who raised themselves to the top by personal effort, by their own merits and gifts, who fought for advancement and achieved successes that they knew they owed only to themselves, these men did not want priestly mediation or intercession. They were still deferential to their social or spiritual betters, but they had a new pride and a new sense of responsibility which encouraged them to question most authorities except the very highest. Another development arising from the bourgeois spirit of the time was the new glorification of manual labor. And this, too, affected the new men's attitude towards the church. For hundreds and thousands of years, the ideal of man had been a sort of unproductive idleness to be abandoned only for destructive or formal or ritual purposes. Most people earned their living by the sweat of their brow, but that's because they had to. To labor was vulgar. Even Christianity, which put prayer and meditation above work and the other pursuits of the world, even Christianity embraced this view. But in the 16th century, Catholics like Rabelais and Protestants like Calvin began to sing another tune, and the lyrics said, "He who doesn't work doesn't deserve to eat." They saw very little piety in the useless lives of monks who prayed but didn't contribute anything concrete to the welfare of their fellow men. And so now monks and priests were envisaged as parasites, avoiding the responsibilities of the world and doing nobody any good, least of all themselves. Moreover, you don't need monks and priests if you have your Bible and you can read it. You've got eternal God on one hand, and you, the believer, on the other, who can receive God's message without any intermediary, who can capture this message directly through the scriptures, which are quite literally the Word of God. There is a profound and subversive logic in Martin Luther, who translated the Bible into this German edition and who asserted every Christian is a priest, every believer is his own priest.
The other very important gift the Reformation furnished to the bourgeoisie was the idea that faith alone justifies and saves the believer. And the thing to realize here
is that the formula of justification by faith, for which so many people accepted persecution and death, was not so much a theological formula as a psychological formula. It offered two things. First of all, it attacked the prevalent Catholic mystique of justification by works, not just good works like founding chantries, not just payment, but also personal mortification, the punishment of the body, the rejection of active life, and so on. Now, this entire value system, which we have seen triumph with the rise of Christianity and monasticism after Mediterranean civilization collapsed 10 or 12 centuries before, this was now rejected by the Reformation in a radical re-evaluation of life, the world, the body, and by a re-evaluation of activity in all these spheres. Activity to the greater glory of God, of course, but also to the glory and the use of the things that God created, which should not be scorned or set aside too lightly. And even when some Protestants became Puritans, tending to renounce or to reject the pleasures of life and of the flesh, a stance which came rather close to a certain Catholic tradition of sainthood. The Puritans still represented a different personality type. Catholics and Protestants might still agree that the world was a terrible place and all that counted was salvation. But Catholics in general preferred to be reassured by a paternalistic church that offered access or at least intercession for salvation, whereas Protestants insisted that you have to forge your own salvation. You have to make it on your own. And you can see how this fitted perfectly with the new urban spirit of enterprise and pragmatism. Justification by faith also abolished the terrible fear that you might die unshriven, unabsolved by a priest of all the sins that imperiled your salvation. And it abolished the cult of the dead, all the prayers and practices that had lain at the heart of Christian sensibility as of so many other religions. So in the new Protestant societies, the endowed masses and chantries and all the activities and monuments that had funneled money away from secular consumption and secular investment, all these came to an end. The house of the Lord shed its splendors for sobriety, the soberness that fits the sober, serious temper of burghers and bankers and scholars who admired Luther for daring to stand up before the emperor himself and to insist on his right to obey his own judgment and his own conscience. After all, the bourgeois also wanted to assert their freedom of conscience, their independence, and reformers like Luther encouraged this. They told the Christian to do his business with God directly without the mediation of priests, to forget saints and relics and any kind of interference in the crucial business of salvation, to open his Bible and read for himself without a priestly interpreter. And in all this, printing was a crucial factor because it provided the Bibles for new model Christians and because it also made the visual propaganda of paintings and sculptures in church seem unnecessary, superfluous. Protestants could afford to be iconoclasts because they were people of the book, and Protestantism was a religion of the book. So the visual arts of Protestants were going to focus not on religious subjects, but on secular ones, on everyday life, on landscapes, on portraits. This is a portrait, a self-portrait of Hieronymus Bosch, a mystical and moralistic painter who died just before Luther nailed his thesis to the Wittenberg chapel door. The paintings of Bosch are eerie. They are like grotesque hallucinations, nightmares of temptation, the fall, and punishment in and beyond a profoundly corrupt world. There is no room in Bosch's works for normal, untroubled people, or at least his extraordinary, ordinary people exist only in terms of spiritual categories like temptation, damnation, salvation. By the time of Peter Bruegel, who lived from 1525 to 1569 and who was a younger contemporary of John Calvin, things had changed quite radically. Bruegel's paintings are mostly landscapes or scenes of peasant life. Bruegel was influenced by Bosch, as most northern painters were at that time, but Bruegel was a humanist. He was didactic, moralizing, and often grotesque, but where Bosch was catastrophic, Bruegel was satirical. He was as Christian as Bosch, and he was passionate in his own way, but his religious ideas were common sense ideas, rational and ethical. He denounced avarice and greed, he ridiculed pretentiousness, and he parodied ceremonies, including religious ceremonies. Bruegel was interested in nature and in real people. Indeed, in very ordinary people, peasants and the poor, who hardly ever attracted anybody's attention before. He did not sweeten or glorify or poeticize these people, but painted them warts and all, which really made him the first modern painter and an example of the forces at work in these times.
On the other hand, it's interesting to note that Bruegel's major patron was a cardinal, and that the Catholic Habsburg princes who governed Belgium for Philip II so admired Bruegel's work that the best place to see his paintings today is the Court Museum in Vienna. Even so, we know that on his deathbed, Bruegel told his wife to burn all his remaining paintings, lest she should get into trouble. So even an artist with high protectors had reason to worry. And we have to bear this in mind when we think of the Catholic counteroffensive, the Counter-Reformation, which set out to clean and reform the Church, as well as fight and defeat the Protestant enemy.
Beginning in 1545, a church council, the Council of Trent, reaffirmed the authority of the Church, of tradition, and of the Church hierarchy. The Inquisition, the special tribunal for identifying and punishing heresy, was also refurbished, and the first thing it did was to attack on the printing front. The first index of prohibited books appeared in 1559, books better burnt than read, and there would be a catechism, a book of questions and answers outlining principles of right belief for all Catholic Christians, and there would be an approved Bible, the Vulgate, written in Latin. There was also the New Society of Jesus, founded by a Spanish knight, Ignatius Loyola, who lived from 1491 to 1556. Loyola was fascinated by chivalric ideals and treated the service of God as a kind of holy knighthood. The Jesuit was an up-to-date version of the Christian athlete, highly trained on the intellectual plane as well as on the spiritual, flexible, adaptable, disciplined, and self-disciplined. Literate, cultivated, subject to a strong central authority, the Jesuits were ready to compete with Protestant enterprise on the educational front, in missionary enterprise, and religious fervor. And their achievements in all these realms were going to be quite remarkable. So the Counter-Reformation was a very powerful force, and the battle lines were drawn. But from this point on, there was going to be choice within Western culture. There was going to be competition. There were going to be battles of books as well as of soldiers. Three of the great elements of modern Western civilization, gunpowder, printing, and the Protestant religion, had come together. We shall see just how explosive the mixture could be in the programs to come. It was Catholic against Protestant, dynasty against dynasty, people against people in the age of the Reformation. Civil war, foreign war, engulfed nearly every power in Europe until the interests of the state triumphed over the interests of faith. The wars of religion, this time on the Western tradition. Edward Gibbon, the great English historian who died 200 years ago, called history the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. Now, of all of these, the 16th and 17th centuries gathered a especially rich harvest. The Protestant Reformation opened a Pandora's box of international and civil conflicts that we call wars of religion because religion was either their cause or their excuse. Central and Northern Europe, England and Scotland and France, all of them found themselves involved in wars with one another, or else in internal struggles with Protestant against Catholic, Catholic against Protestant, sometimes Protestant against Protestant and Catholic against Catholic. Behind the religious issue, however, there stood other crucial interests. Rival dynasties, like those that ruled in France or Spain. Rival social orders, peasants against lords in Germany, cities against their overlords in the Netherlands, princes against the emperor in Germany. Nobles against the crown in England, in France. But these political struggles were more fierce because the opposition of faiths introduced a complicating factor. Few men can be crueler than would-be martyrs who have escaped the executioner's axe. By the 1530s, the cantons of Switzerland had fought a bloody civil war and settled into a division between Protestant and Catholic cantons, which still endures today. And in 1555, the German states ended an entire generation of religious conflict by signing the Peace of Augsburg. As in Switzerland, this was simply an agreement to disagree and to localize the conflict as far as possible. The Peace of Augsburg was no more lasting than any other peace. It kept a sort of truce for half a century, but its importance lay in the formula on which it was based. Cuius regio eius religio, the religion of the ruler shall be the religion of his subjects. So unity in religion had become an element in the unity of the state. Everybody in one state must belong to the same church or get out. And this replaced the universal Christian church of the Middle Ages with a model of national conformity and international diversity. But just as Central Europe got a breathing space, Western Europe began to get into trouble. In England in 1535, King Henry VIII broke with Rome because he wanted a divorce from his wife, who hadn't produced a male heir. But the Pope wouldn't approve the divorce, so in the Reformation settlement, Henry set up his own national church, the Church of England. He became the first sovereign prince to take over the Roman Church, subject it openly and totally to the state, and use its property to strengthen the crown and the crown's supporters.
This Reformation settlement remained uncertain for 150 years, and it contributed to a lot of insecurity in England. But Henry's second daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, who was crowned in 1558, helped to stabilize the situation by introducing a new idea: tolerance in return for payment. You were allowed to worship in your own way, but you had to do it in private, and you had to pay for it, because it was a privilege to be different from everybody else. Elizabeth and her successors didn't really trust the Catholics, not because they had a different faith, but because their faith made some of them function as a fifth column of England's Catholic enemies, especially Spain. So Elizabeth kept her eye on them, and she fined them, but she also gave up the attempt to secure uniformity by force, and she made a virtue from necessity, or at least a profit.
Meanwhile, trouble was brewing in France and in the Netherlands. Political problems and religious problems there produced an explosive mixture which blew up in the 1560s and 70s. It led to an almost endless series of wars for the rest of the century, with French fighting French, Belgians fighting the Dutch, the English helping the Protestants both in Holland and in France, and the Spaniards fighting everybody at one time or another. Catholic France had been burning Protestant reformers since the 1520s. But Protestantism also attracted quite a number of French nobles who found it a convenient stalking horse against the crown, which had been getting stronger at their expense. French Protestants were called Huguenots, from the German term for confederates, and politically they often represented a feudal reaction against the encroaching, centralized state. But Catholicism was popular in France, and the Catholic party had the advantage of Spanish subsidies, so the civil war dragged on, marked by small battles and big massacres. The most famous massacre took place on St. Bartholomew's Night in August 1572, and on the following day, killing several thousand Protestants in Paris and the provinces. The Pope, when he heard the news, ordered a Te Deum, a hymn of praise, and declared that the massacre pleased him more than 50 victories against the Turks. Philip II of Spain also rejoiced. It said that this was the only time in his life when he laughed. Not all the power of Philip, however, could prevent the Protestants of the Netherlands from freeing themselves from Spanish Catholic rule. Under the leadership of William of Orange, they separated from the southern Belgian provinces, which remained Catholic, and set up a new free state called the United Provinces, also known as Holland, from the name of the biggest and richest of these provinces. Having lost a good chunk of the Netherlands, Philip now tried to find compensation by winning greater influence in France, perhaps by getting control of France as the protector of the Catholic party there. But with all the help he gave the French Catholics, Philip could not prevent a Huguenot prince from succeeding to the French throne, Henry of Bourbon, Prince of Béarn in the Pyrenees, who was next in line of succession. There was more civil war in France, and it devastated the country. It came to an end only when Henry decided to become a Catholic, declaring that Paris was worth a mass. Conversion seemed to be the only way to secure unity for France and to get the crown for himself, and it worked. In 1594, Henry entered Paris, which had resisted him as long as he remained a Huguenot. He was crowned as Henry IV, and he united both Catholics and Huguenots against the Spanish enemy. And after another 3 years of war, he forced the Spaniards to make peace. But Henry's biggest task was to establish peace inside France. On the same day that the peace with Spain was signed, May 2nd, 1598, he promulgated the famous Edict of Nantes, named after the city where it was signed. This was to serve as the base of religious peace in France until Louis XIV revoked it about a century later. The edict succeeded because it made the Catholics feel they had won, and it made the Huguenots feel secure, since they were allowed to worship in their own fashion. And for the next 100 years, the Huguenots were going to contribute much that was vital and worthwhile to France's economy, its politics, and its culture. Now, if I may leave the Huguenots busy contributing, I want to say a few things about one of the most important results of this series of conflicts which you realize were mainly civil wars. They were internal struggles in which religious dissensions threatened again and again to tear a country apart, to destroy political and social unity for the sake of religious unity and belief, to undermine the power of the state and the welfare of society for the sake of the church, and to massacre great numbers of people for the greater glory of God. Not surprisingly, there was a reaction to this bloody waste, a reaction most clearly reflected in the appearance of a point of view, eventually of a group of men, known as the politiques. And politiques is a term that I might best define as sagacious, prudent men interested in government that works. And the rise and the influence of the politiques towards the end of the 16th century was really the most notable sign of the times. The very fact that politiques existed testified to the fact that for a lot of people, the religion of the state as a symbol of order and stability, this was starting to look more important than the religion of the church. Or, alternately, you might say that religion was becoming more individual, more of a private affair, while the civil, secular state power was recognized as having more immediate claims, more pressing claims than those of the church. In the great crisis of the Reformation, religious people had felt that everything had to give way to the interests of religion. But now, the politiques felt that everything had to give way to the interests of the state. And the most important of these interests, given the terrible effects of civil war, was national unity. And if toleration of other religions was necessary to keep the country together, then all right, they would be tolerant. Now, this was something new. Truth has always appeared indivisible. You cannot allow untruth to survive. You cannot be neutral between good and evil. Martin Luther, after he had sowed his wild oats, neither desired nor believed in tolerance. John Calvin never dreamt about it. You were either a persecutor or else persecuted. And there was nothing the persecuted liked so much as becoming persecutors. But for the politiques and for princes like Henry IV, tolerance was an instrument of state. They didn't say that persecution was always wrong. They just said that tolerance was sometimes right. Their attitude was, let's see if it works. After all, it didn't look as if either the French Protestants or the Catholics were really strong enough to beat the other into submission. So, you find a gradual development of the view that you cannot identify loyalty with orthodoxy, that in Catholic France, a man could be a Protestant and a good Frenchman too. A similar attitude developed in Protestant England, where Queen Elizabeth and her ministers were much more interested in the welfare of the country than in what language they were going to hear religious service. There was persecution of Catholics in England, but they were not persecuted because they were Catholics, but because they wanted to undermine the Queen and the constitution of the country. A Catholic could be a Catholic as long as he stayed at home and didn't conspire against the Queen, which is much the same idea as lay behind the Edict of Nantes. You can see how novel this was by contrasting it to the Spanish Inquisition, which was established a century earlier in 1479. The Inquisition didn't just want to get rid of a heretic because he was a danger to society. It was interested in his soul. It might have to torture him into salvation, but it would do its best to save him, even in spite of himself. The politics, however, didn't care about a man's soul. They only cared about his power or his nuisance value, and they were prepared to come to terms with reality, provided they could get practical results, that is, the unity, stability, security of the state. And to further these interests, they were ready to ignore the interests or the orders of the church, any church. They were ready to ignore the church for the sake of the nation. So the wars of religion paradoxically led to a downgrading of the importance of religion. It dwindled into one department of life. It became a private matter, not immediately, but gradually, until in the 19th century we find a Victorian politician remarking that things have come to a pretty pass if religion is going to interfere with private life. And this is an idea which no medieval man could possibly have entertained or understood. Still, the so-called wars of religion were not over yet. The greatest of them, and the last, was going to be the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. This drew in almost every power in Europe: Swedes and Danes, Germans, Bohemians, Spaniards, and Frenchmen. It started when Ferdinand of Bohemia ascended the throne in 1617, determined to restore his lands to Catholicism and to revoke the religious freedoms of Bohemian Protestants. within a few years, the conflict escalated into international warfare. Armies, as usual, did more harm to the civilian population than to each other, but things got so bad that even the soldiers suffered, as you can see in these engravings by the French artist Jacques Callot. William Harvey, the English physician, the same man who discovered the circulation of the blood, traveled across Central Europe during the war and noted that, by the way, we could scarcely see a dog, crow, kite, raven, or any bird, or anything to anatomize, only some few miserable people, the relics of the war and the plague, where famine had made anatomies before I came. As the great English poet Milton asked, what can war but endless war still breed? The only hope in this sort of situation is exhaustion. And by 1648, everybody was exhausted. It had been the worst catastrophe in Central Europe since the Black Death of the 14th century. The fighting finally came to an end with the Treaty of Westphalia, which reasserted the right of each ruler to determine his land's religion. It confirmed the territorial sovereignty of Germany's many principalities, which would serve to perpetuate German division and political weakness. It confirmed the position of France as a great European power, and it confirmed the decline of Spain. But the treaty also made clear the declining importance of religion. Although the 30 Years' War started out Catholic against Protestant, it ended with two chief contenders, both of whom were Catholic, France and Spain. Catholic had fought Catholic, Protestant had fought Protestant, according to national or dynastic interests. And so the last war of religion was also the first, ultimately, to ignore religion. The fighting, the misery, the suffering had dulled religious sensibilities. And besides, after 1648, Catholic and Protestant positions were pretty much stabilized anyway. If you look at the map, you can also see a curious coincidence. On the whole, the territory of the old Roman Empire stays Roman Catholic. The barbarian lands beyond the borders of Rome are Protestant, which suggests how profoundly some structures can affect culture over the centuries. There are exceptions to this pattern, of course, but the general lines are clear. Equally clear to contemporaries was the fact that the great mass of people would eventually accept whatever was given or imposed by their rulers, including religion. They might rebel at times, but it was usually about bread or taxes, not higher principles. Material reality and their precarious existence weighed too heavily upon them. Their horizons were narrow, their submission traditional, and this worked in favor of the established authority, whatever its creed or its political color. The people were there to be used and manipulated by a tiny political class and would remain so for a very long time. In a later program, we shall see the further evolution of established authority into the absolute monarchies of the 17th century. But even as the dynastic states were coming into their own, a greater novelty was taking shape: the republican patriotism of the United Provinces of Holland, which had cast off Spanish rule. So, from this point on, patriotism did not have to identify with a dynasty. It could identify with a free community that described itself as a res publica, which literally means the common thing, or the common good, or as the English called it, the Commonwealth. The Dutch set up the first modern Commonwealth in the 16th century, and the English tried to imitate them in the 17th century. And these fragile models, founded on the ideal of citizen freedom and citizen wealth, or wealth-being, were particularly important for the Western tradition because they foretold the republics of the 18th and 19th centuries, including our own republic. And equally significant was their growth out of and around cities, the direct successors of medieval city-states and the centers of new and vital economic activity. We shall take a closer look at this phenomenon next time, because while wars and politics are important, there are also less obvious forces at work that affect the outcome of wars and that affect how most people live. And these are economic forces whose base in the modern world is in urban society, as we shall see in our next program, when we leave the path of armies and princes and follow the path of money instead. Money, trade, profits, enterprise, without them the machinery of the state could not have turned. And most of that money was made here, in places like Venice, Antwerp, Amsterdam, where freedom was prized and our modern world was born. The rise of the trading cities, this time on the Western tradition. Last time, we looked at some of the political and religious factors at work in the 16th and 17th centuries, and if you remember, we even saw a graphic example of how the long experience of Roman rule 1,000 years before was still impressed upon the face of Europe in the location of Roman Catholic states. Today, I would like to suggest another basic structure which is not political, not religious, but geographic and economic. Back in 843, the three grandsons of Charlemagne signed a treaty that divided the empire between them, and the Treaty of Verdun gave one brother the west, which we now call France, and another the east, more or less Germany. But the older brother, who got the imperial crown, got a long strip of land running from the Low Countries to Italy, and because his name was Lothair, this land was named Lotharingia. Lotharingia looks terribly artificial for a state and impossible to defend. And in fact, it didn't last very long. But if you look again, you see that it reflects a geographical and economic reality. It runs from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, and it includes the major economic centers and the main lines of communication between them: the Rhine, the Alpine passes, and of course Italy. And in the 20th century, it becomes the spinal cord of the European economy, so keep your eyes on it. Now, when European trade revived in the Middle Ages, that revival was anchored at the two ends of what was once Lothar's realm, the Low Countries and Italy, especially Italy, where one great business and manufacturing center was Florence. Here, between the two ends, then as now, stretched the axis of European commerce. Around the Alpine passes and along the Rhine, trading towns grew up or were reborn, like Cologne. And the rest of trade revolved around that axis. In the north, a league of German cities called the Hansa, Riga, Danzig, and this one Lübeck, mostly along the Baltic and connecting with Scandinavia, Poland and Russia. In the center were Champagne with its fairs, where merchants from north and south could meet about halfway, Lyon between the Rhone and the Alps, and Augsburg between the Danube and the Rhine, and also close to the Alps. But the real wealth of the Middle Ages was at the gateways. Venice, on which the Mediterranean trade was focused, and Bruges, on which the Baltic and North Sea trade was focused. In the 16th century, however, Venice began to decline. She was no longer mistress of the Mediterranean because of the Turks, and she was no longer mistress of the spice trade because of the Portuguese. With the age of discovery, the Atlantic had taken over from the Mediterranean. As for Bruges, its harbor was silted up, and the shipping that normally would have gone to her shifted next door to Antwerp. The Portuguese took their spices to Antwerp, and the heavy goods from the Baltic also went there, grain, lumber, and herring, a crucial fish when there were 2 fast days a week, plus Lent. But then Antwerp declined as well, ruined by the wars of religion, and the wealth and the power that went with the wealth shifted to another North Sea port a bit up the coast, Amsterdam. Of course, this is a very schematic and superficial account of developments that took 4 centuries, roughly from 1200 to 1600. But what it helps to make clear is that all this time, and increasingly so, production, exchange, capital, wealth, credit were not at the courts of princes, but in these trading cities. Without their loans, without their other financial services, the princes couldn't operate. They especially couldn't make war, which was their chief occupation. And so, while dynastic states made war, city-states made profits. The cities also created basic instruments and institutions which were going to affect our culture considerably. For instance, 14th century Venice concentrated merchants and bankers and money changers, often the same person, not just in one town, but in one small area near the Rialto Bridge. They could transfer goods and money from one another by simple bookkeeping. Payments could be transferred without the use of cash, without waiting for a fare. Overdrafts were possible. Credit notes appeared, and so did something like a stock exchange. These meetings on the Rialto fixed commodity prices, they fixed interest rates on public and private loans, and then they fixed premiums for marine insurance. Just round the corner from the Rialto was the Calle delle Sicurtà, Insurance Street. And so in 14th century Venice, big business was already concentrated, and it worked in ways we can recognize today. All this high finance went on in the open air. In London, which was a backward, unsophisticated place, the Italians got together in Lombard Street, where the Bank of England stands today, walking in the rain when it raineth, more like peddlers than merchants, a contemporary noted. To save themselves from getting wet, traders began to build loggias, arcades, not just in Italy, but also in the north. This one is in Amsterdam. At Bruges, they built one on a square known as the Börseplatz. So Bourse or Börse, which also means purse, is what a stock exchange is called in most European languages. The characteristic of a trading city was that it was cosmopolitan and that it was tolerant. When Amsterdam built a new town hall, the major statue on it was of Atlas lifting up the globe with all the nations of the world offering their goods to an allegorical Amsterdam. So while Protestant and Catholic fought in Europe and overseas in the 16th and 17th centuries, they still traded in Antwerp, in Amsterdam, or wherever the trading was good. Great ports were described as a Tower of Babel or a Noah's Ark. They wouldn't have been great if their population and their visitors hadn't been able to coexist and to work in peace. One thing this meant was city government strong enough to impose security and order. Streets were better patrolled in Antwerp than in Paris, and brawls were put down fast. Order was enforced by the Guard, and the Guard companies of citizen volunteers were part of the city hierarchy and also part of its sociability. It's one of these Guard companies in Amsterdam that Rembrandt captured in his painting The Night Watch. And there were many other depictions of guards and guilds which were very different from what you found in more aristocratic societies. In 17th century Amsterdam, widows and orphans were placed in orphanages and almshouses and set to spinning wool. The deserving poor got free food and fuel. The orphanage got the profit from garbage, which was collected and sold as field manure. And we're told that even the cats were organized with an office where at certain hours of the day a great number of cats are fed, which afterwards hunt among the stores for mice and rats. Still, cats and beggars weren't the first priority. Making money was, and big business had as many grand designs as nation-states did. One such design was the creation of joint stock companies to trade with the Indies, and an East India Company was set up in London in 1600, then another in Amsterdam 2 years later, and similar companies imitated them in other countries. These companies traded as single units, dividing their profits among stockholders who could buy or sell their shares in the exchange, and dividends were as high as 30% a year. Now, today we find stock exchanges, stock companies commonplace. But in those days, it all had to be invented, and it was exceptional. Equally exceptional was the first public bank, the Bank of Amsterdam, set up in 1610, a bank that attracted so many depositors, so many investors, that the Dutch could always borrow money at 2 or 3% less than any competitor, and this gave them a great advantage in business and in war. There is a story about an East India Company man talking to the Sultan of Java and suggesting that the Sultan encourage his people to trade, to become richer, to pay taxes, and so on. And the Sultan replies, "My people, unlike yours, have nothing they can call their own. Everything they have belongs to me." Now, that sort of people might produce a surplus if forced, but not much of one. But if the first priority of the cities was making money, the second was freedom. Not freedom for its own sake, but freedom to go about your business and do more or less as you please, as long as you don't trouble the public order. This miracle of tolerance was found wherever trade was dominant. In 17th century Amsterdam, the Calvinist pastors preached against prostitutes and Jews, but the city council ignored them. It tolerated Jews and dissenters as it tolerated Catholics, not because of any ideal, but because tolerance brought in trade and talent and capital. There was another aspect of the new cities that was modern, and that was their element of show. In a world where entertainment was rare and costly, the streets and markets were a show in themselves. The public buildings were something to see, and so were the monuments, and even the art collections in private houses which you could usually visit for a tip. Visitors meant income for local inns, taverns, and tradesmen. So, on one hand, cities wanted to show off. On the other, they wanted to provide facilities that were pleasing to their citizens and attractive to outsiders. Not just public monuments, better streets, public gardens, public walks. Amsterdam impressed everyone by how neat and clean it was, partly because it allowed few horses and fewer carriages. Rome, whose major industry was pilgrims, paid a lot of attention to show, if not to cleanliness, in its great churches and splendid monuments. In the feasts and diversions, the plays, banquets, shops, and facilities catering to a population of tourists and pilgrims and priests, perhaps the most cosmopolitan population in Europe. In the refectory of the Jesuit college, you could hear 27 languages spoken. In St. Peter's Cathedral, you could make your confession in almost any language. Just as important, if you went down to the market in the Piazza Navona when there wasn't a bullfight or a special race, you could see jugglers, tightrope walkers, performing animals, you name it, at any time. And you didn't even have to pay to watch. Rome didn't even mind Protestant tourists, even at the height of the Counter-Reformation. And this is proof that other interests can be as strong as religious interests. Reality is seldom black or white. 17th century Catholic Rome was permissive and non-conformist, and probably more open to free speech than anywhere except Amsterdam. Some popes were repressive and the Inquisition carried on, but the popular mood was broad-minded because it was in the popular interest to be broad-minded. Just because they had so much in common at one level, it's instructive to compare Rome with Amsterdam. Amsterdam turned on trade, everything was focused on that. There were no monasteries, no cathedral, no castle, no university, and the churches were rather inconspicuous. The houses didn't try to proclaim or reflect the wealth of their owners. They were built more for comfort than for show. There was none of the grandeur of Rome or the glamour of Venice. There were canals and trees along the quays, and things were orderly, so minds and capital and energies could concentrate on making money, not on spending it. Rome was quite different. The 1600s were the great age of the Baroque, a style whose name derives from the Portuguese word for irregular, which the Portuguese applied to imperfectly shaped pearls. Baroque is dramatic, grand, full of movement and emotion, perfectly suited to express the theatrical tensions of the Counter-Reformation and its desire to impress. Baroque architecture reasserts authority by gigantic productions. It dazzles. It enlists stage design to political ends. And you can see this spirit best, perhaps, in the work of Bernini or in that of Rubens in Catholic Flanders, with his mythologies and allegories and acres of sumptuous flesh. They're just the opposite of the unassuming realism of a 17th century Dutch painter like Paul Potter, or the quiet lack of artifice you get in a painting by Vermeer. Incredibly luminous, yet perfectly realistic. From this, you feel certain that it isn't the grand who will inherit the earth, but the simple, or at least I like to think so. The towering figures of 17th century science were men of modest origin. Galileo was the son of a musician. Newton was the son of a yeoman farmer. And the two are linked by the fact that Newton was born in the same year that Galileo died. But they have more in common, because the junction of Newton's mathematical genius and Galileo's mechanical genius created a scientific revolution. Essentially, Galileo's telescopic observations and mathematical calculations extended the bounds of the visible universe so that he was able to justify celestial phenomena and terrestrial ones into one theory subject to the same laws, the laws of mechanics. Newton, you might say, carried Galileo's work to a logical conclusion when he worked out the law of gravity, which he named from the Roman gravitas, or weightiness, a law which explained the movement of all bodies on earth as in the heavens. Alexander Pope wrote his epitaph: "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light." This age of great and bloody wars of religion, then, was also an age of light. In art, which fascinates the painters from Rembrandt and Vermeer to Georges de la Tour, but also, we have seen, in science. The telescope, which Galileo developed, was invented in Holland. So was the microscope. And it's worth remembering that scientific discovery did not depend on religion. Copernicus, the Polish astronomer who suggested that the Earth turns on its axis and also around the sun, Copernicus was a canon of his cathedral. Kepler, the German who discovered that the Earth and other planets travel around the sun in elliptical orbits, was a maverick Lutheran who nevertheless was a high servant of the Holy Roman Emperor, because the Emperor Rudolf didn't care as long as you were a good magician. Galileo, who got into trouble for supporting Copernicus' theory that the planets revolve around the sun, was for a long time a member in good standing of the church. And Galileo's problem was very serious, because he had shown the heavens to be no different from Earth. The moon was pockmarked, the sun had spots, and so on and so on. His observations shattered what had been assumed to be a basic difference between heaven and earth. If heavenly objects were not immutable and perfect, where then was the realm of God? Given the gravity of his transgression, the mere house arrest under which Galileo ended his life working to the end seems pretty mild. Even rationalism wasn't a Protestant monopoly. It was Pope Gregory XIII who, in 1582, promulgated the new improved calendar that we still use and call the Gregorian calendar. Descartes, the 17th century patron saint of rationalism, was a Catholic too. He coined the famous axiom, "I think, therefore I am," and found it more economical to conform in religion and think about other things. But he also found it more convenient to spend most of his life in Protestant Holland. So there was a difference. A great admirer of Descartes was Baruch Spinoza, who grew up in Amsterdam, the son of Jewish refugees from the Portuguese Inquisition. Spinoza was excommunicated by the Jewish authorities for holding heretical views. Although he made his living by grinding and polishing lenses for spectacles, telescopes, microscopes, what he really was interested in was truth. Truth about religion, which he wanted to purge of miracles and prophecies. Truth about the state, which he said had a natural and rational foundation. Both were part of the same problem. You had to drive out fear and hatred. You had to bring reason back to earth. Baruch Spinoza was 16 years old when the 30 Years' War finally ended.
As a tree is judged by its fruit, said Spinoza, so men and institutions should be judged by their actions. Then leave everybody free to think for himself and judge by their works whether they are pious or not. And the same with politics. No one should be held to live as somebody else wills. No one has the right to force someone else to do what he doesn't want to do. Everyone is the natural born protector of his own rights. So, the Dutch Republican experience had clearly colored Spinoza's philosophy, which is a hymn to tolerance, to freedom of thought, to democracy, all very subversive, and a precursor of things to come. And this is the point. Protestants were not models of tolerance, and Catholics were not models of oppression, but material and intellectual enterprise came more easily and could be pursued more comfortably in Protestant countries than in Catholic countries. And the most forward-looking, the most challenging creations of the human mind were going to come first in Holland and then from England, nations of shopkeepers.